If you time travelled to Scandinavia during the Viking Age, between the late 8th and early 11th centuries, you would not awaken to scenes of conquest or longships crashing onto foreign shores. You would wake instead inside a small wooden building, dark and smoky, in a world shaped far more by routine labour than by battle. The Viking Age was, for most people, not an age of raiding. It was an age of farming, fishing, crafting, and enduring the extremes of Northern Europe's climate. The overwhelming majority of Scandinavians during this period were rural people. They lived in small settlements composed of family farms, where extended households worked the land and relied on each other to survive. These farms were often isolated, separated by dense forests, fjords and mountains. The population density was low, and life was governed by seasonal rhythms that dictated everything from diet to social life. The typical home was a longhouse, a rectangular single-room structure built from timber with walls insulated using turf or wattle and daub. Roofs were covered in sod or wooden shingles, designed to hold in heat and withstand heavy snowfall. Inside, there were no private rooms. The central hearth provided heat, light, and a place to cook. Family members, farmhands, and even livestock might share this single communal space. Smoke from the hearth escaped through a hole in the roof, but ventilation was poor, and the air inside was often heavy with soot. If you found yourself in one of these dwellings, you'd notice how cramped and dim it was. Bedding consisted of straw mattresses or animal hides laid along the wall benches, which doubled as seating during the day. Personal space was virtually non-existent. Most people slept fully clothed in woolen tunics and cloaks, using their outer garments for additional warmth during the long winter nights. Cleanliness was relative. Weekly bathing was common by medieval standards, and Scandinavians were considered unusually hygienic by their European contemporaries. Still, with limited access to hot water and soap, laundry was infrequent. Soap was made from animal fat and ash, and clothing was washed in cold streams or buckets. Most garments were wool or linen, hand-woven on vertical looms. Dyeing was possible, but expensive. Most people wore greys, browns, and muted reds derived from local plants. Upon waking, a Viking Age farmer or fisher would begin their day without fanfare. The first tasks of the morning might involve feeding animals, pigs, sheep, goats or cattle, and checking on tools stored in small outbuildings. If it was winter, wood would need to be fetched, fires rekindled, and any snow cleared from pathways. In summer, the day began earlier, with more hours of light for labour. Breakfast was simple and hearty. Common foods included dense barley or rye bread, dried or pickled fish, cheese and porridges made from grains or legumes. In coastal areas, dried cod, known as stockfish, was a dietary staple. Inland, fermented dairy products like sour milk and skyr were common. The diet was seasonally limited, and food preservation was essential. Salt, smoke, and fermentation were the main preservation techniques. There were no cellars or ice houses, and fresh food was rare in winter. Water was collected from wells or nearby streams. It was generally clean in rural areas, though in larger settlements or coastal trading posts, contamination was more common. Ale made from barley was often consumed instead of water, especially during communal meals or feasts. It was weak in alcohol, but high in calories, and safer than stagnant water. Daily labour varied by gender, age, and social class. Men typically worked outdoors, performing agricultural tasks, repairing fences, hunting, fishing, or travelling to nearby things. Local assemblies where disputes were resolved and laws discussed. Women managed the home, oversaw the food stores, spun wool, wove cloth, cared for children, and helped with the animals. Gender roles were strict, but not absolute. Wealthy women could inherit property, run households, and even commission ships. Some women, particularly in border regions or among the Sami people of the far north, participated in hunting, trade, or spiritual roles. Children began working early. By the age of 7 or 8, they assisted with simple chores: tending livestock, carrying firewood, fetching water, helping with weaving or tool maintenance. Education, as modern societies would define it, did not exist. Knowledge was passed down orally. Skills, stories, genealogy, and law were memorized and recited. While Viking society is often romanticized for its warriors and seafarers, in truth, only a small minority of men ever participated in raiding or long-distance voyages. Those who did were often younger sons without land to inherit, or seasoned traders seeking new routes. A few were hired mercenaries or part of elite retinues in foreign courts. For the majority, life revolved around their immediate environment: the land, the weather, and the extended family. The average farmstead was semi-self-sufficient. In addition to growing grains and vegetables, many households kept bees for honey, raised chickens for eggs, and brewed their own ale. Fishing, especially along the Norwegian coast, was a vital source of income and nutrition. Nets and lines were made from plant fibres or horsehair, and boats, often small and open, were pulled manually with oars or sailed short distances along the coast. Storms were deadly, and maritime skill was passed down carefully. Iron tools were valuable but common. Every household possessed a few knives, axes, and scythes. Blacksmiths worked locally and produced both tools and weapons. Wealthier families might have a sword, a symbol of status more than utility. Shields were circular, made of wood and reinforced with metal rims and a central boss. Bows and spears were used for hunting as well as war. In the absence of centralized authority in much of early Viking Scandinavia, law and justice were handled communally. Assemblies, or things, were gatherings where disputes were heard, and compensation was negotiated. Justice was restorative rather than punitive. Offences were often settled with payments of vergild, or man price, calculated according to the status of the injured party. Violence did occur, especially in feuds between rival families, but outright lawlessness was rare in settled communities. Honour, reputation, and kinship ties maintained order. Religion in the Viking world was animistic and polytheistic. People worshipped a pantheon of gods: Odin, Thor, Freya, Njord, and believed in spirits inhabiting the land, trees, and waters. Sacrifices, or blots, were held at key times in the agricultural year: midwinter, spring planting, harvest. Offerings of meat, grain, or animals were made to ensure fertility and protection. In some cases, especially during large communal ceremonies, animals were ritually slaughtered and shared in a feast. Burial practices reflected spiritual beliefs. Cremation and inhumation both occurred, often with grave goods meant to assist in the afterlife. While Christianity began to spread into Scandinavia in the 9th and 10th centuries, particularly through trade contacts and missionaries from the British Isles and Carolingian Empire, most rural communities held traditional beliefs well into the 11th century. In some areas, both belief systems coexisted, with crosses and Thor's hammers worn side by side. If you were to walk through a village or hamlet during this time, you would find buildings arranged around open courtyards or paths. There were no streets, as in Roman cities, but rather trodden earth routes between homes, workshops, and animal pens. Roofs were low, sometimes covered in grass. Smoke seeped constantly from roof holes. Outside, tools hung from walls, meat dried on racks, and children played with carved wooden animals or rolled bones in simple games. The climate shaped everything. Winters were long, with deep snow and frozen ground. Firewood had to be stockpiled months in advance. In some regions, snowshoes and sleds were common, and hunting became the main source of protein. Summers, though short, were industrious. Crops had to be planted, hay cut and dried, thatch repaired, boats tarred. Every task was urgent, because each season held the weight of the next one's survival. In short, to time travel to ancient Scandinavia, ruled by Vikings, is not to join a warrior band or sail toward glory. It is to wake up early in a small wooden house, perform endless manual labour, respect elders, follow customs, and hope for good weather. It is to live quietly, but not unimportantly. The foundation of Viking culture was not carved only in stone runes or sung in sagas. It was laid every day by hands just like yours, doing work that never made it into history books, but held up the world just the same. If you remained in a rural Viking Age village for more than a day, you'd soon become attuned to the quiet order of its cycles. How everything, from work to worship, moved according to season, sunlight, and necessity. The society you'd witness was not lawless nor backward, but deeply structured, even if that structure didn't resemble the bureaucracies or monarchies of more centralized European kingdoms. Scandinavian life in this era was shaped more by custom than by decree, and more by kinship than by kings. Your surroundings would be modest but purposeful. The longhouse where the family slept, ate, and worked functioned as the heart of the homestead. Alongside it might stand a few smaller outbuildings, a shed for tools, a storehouse for grain or meat, a barn if the family kept cattle or goats. These buildings were simple, constructed of upright posts and horizontal planks, fastened with wooden pegs or iron nails if the family could afford them. They were not insulated in the modern sense, but earth-packed walls and turf roofs provided a surprising amount of warmth. Daily life began early. In spring and summer, people rose shortly after the first light, often before the sun crested the hills or the sea. There were no curtains, no shutters to close out the morning. In the winter, daylight was scarce. Further north in Norway or Sweden, there might be only a few usable hours of dim light during the heart of the cold season, and even southern farms had to rely on lamplight and fire after mid-afternoon. Fuel was precious. Firewood had to be collected from nearby forests. Birch, pine, or ash trees felled and dried for months before use. Peat was also harvested, especially in wetter regions. It burned more slowly and emitted less flame, but gave off enough heat to boil water or bake flatbread. The fire at the centre of the home rarely went out. It was carefully banked at night and rekindled each morning. Without it, there was no warmth, no cooking, no light. Most tools used in everyday labour were simple but effective. The axe was perhaps the most indispensable tool in Viking society. Not just a weapon, but a carpenter's and farmer's implement. Its uses included chopping wood, building homes, splitting firewood, and clearing land. Other tools included iron knives, bone or antler awls, wooden rakes, and ploughs tipped with iron if the owner was wealthy enough. Tools were often inherited and repaired multiple times before being replaced. For most people, iron was valuable and used sparingly. Farming was the foundation of the Viking economy, particularly in Denmark and southern Sweden. The growing season was brief, perhaps only 4 or 5 months, so every hour of sun had to be used efficiently. In spring, farmers sowed barley, rye, and oats. These were hardy crops that could survive cold and wet weather. The grain was used for bread, ale, gruel, and animal feed. Turnips and beans might be planted alongside. Tools for planting were primitive, wooden spades and hoes. Fertilizer came from livestock manure, composted straw, or even dried seaweed. Harvesting happened in late summer or early autumn. The grain was cut with sickles, bound into sheaves, and stacked in open fields or in barns to dry. It was threshed by hand, usually with flails, to separate the edible grain from the chaff. Women often led this work, supported by children and elders. Once threshed, the grain was ground into flour using hand-powered quern stones. 2 circular stones rotated against each other. This was physically exhausting and could take hours to produce a few handfuls of usable flour. Meat and dairy played an important role in the diet. Pigs were favoured because they grew quickly and could forage in forests, requiring less pasture. Goats and sheep provided milk, meat, and wool. Cattle, while prized, were more difficult to maintain and needed extensive winter feed. Most animals were slaughtered in the late autumn when fodder ran low. The meat was preserved by salting, drying, or smoking over slow-burning fires. This food had to last through the dark, lean winter months, when fresh food was nearly impossible to find. Fishing was crucial in coastal regions and along rivers. Nets were hand-woven from plant fibres or sinew, and weights were often carved from stone or bone. Simple lines and hooks made from iron or bone were used for cod, herring, trout, and flatfish. Shellfish, such as mussels and clams, were gathered in baskets woven from willow or birch bark. In the far north, dried fish became a form of currency, lightweight, storable, and high in protein. Boats used for fishing were narrow, often clinker-built like their larger longship cousins, and powered by oars. Seasonal labour also included haymaking, turf cutting, animal shearing, tanning hides, and brewing ale. Each of these tasks required time, cooperation, and planning. Hay was essential. Without it, livestock would not survive the winter. It was cut with scythes and laid out in wide fields to dry. Once dry, it was bundled, carried, and stored in lofts or open-sided barns. A poorly timed rainstorm could ruin a week's work and endanger a family's food security for months. Shearing sheep took place in late spring or early summer. The wool was cleaned, carded with brushes made from metal or teasels, and spun on a drop spindle into usable thread. Weaving was performed on upright looms, and skilled weavers could produce everything from coarse, everyday cloth to decorative patterns using tablet weaving or brocade. These skills were essential. There was no importing garments, and every family made its own clothing, often reusing old fabric or stitching new garments from inherited patterns. Clothing varied depending on status and material availability. A typical man wore a tunic made of wool, belted at the waist, with trousers made from wool or linen. A woman wore a long wool dress, often layered over a linen underdress fastened at the shoulders with oval brooches, an iconic style in Viking archaeology. Both sexes wore cloaks in colder weather, fastened with a pin or tied at the shoulder. Footwear was made from soft leather, cut and stitched by hand. In winter, fur-lined boots and wool wrappings were used to keep warm. Inside the longhouse, the division of labour was clear. While men often worked outdoors, the interior domain was typically managed by women. Food preparation, textile work, brewing, and child rearing were central domestic tasks. Tools for spinning, looms, clay cooking vessels, wooden spoons, and soapstone pots were found across the Norse world. The hearth was the symbolic centre of the home, where meals were cooked and stories told. Children slept in alcoves or shared straw mattresses near the fire. Elders were given the warmest spots and the most respect. The social structure of Viking Age Scandinavia was stratified, though mobility was possible. At the top were the jarls, nobility, often landowning with influence, wealth and armed retainers. Below them were the carls, free farmers, craftsmen and traders who formed the backbone of society. At the bottom were thralls, enslaved people who worked in households or fields. Thralls could be captured in war or born into slavery, but they could also be freed. Manumission was not uncommon, and freed thralls could sometimes become prosperous. Wealth was measured not only in silver, but in land, livestock, and prestige. A man's honour could depend on how many warriors he could host, or how many animals he could offer during a feast. Feasting itself was central to social life, both a ritual and a political act. Mead, ale, and food were shared in longhouses, where alliances were made, tales recited, and disputes quietly resolved through gift-giving and poetry. Though many imagine Vikings as raiders, most Norse people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born. Travel was difficult. Roads, where they existed, were muddy tracks at best. Waterways were the highways of the north. Rivers, fjords, and the Baltic Sea connected communities across long distances. Coastal traders carried furs, amber, walrus ivory, iron, soapstone and slaves. In exchange they received glass, silk, wine and coin, rare commodities that found their way back to even remote villages. By the 9th century, some larger settlements had begun to emerge: Kopang in Norway, Birka in Sweden, Hedeby in what is now Germany. These were trade hubs, seasonal markets, and gathering places for craftspeople and merchants. But most people still lived in isolated or clustered farms, working with extended families and rarely interacting with outsiders beyond nearby neighbours or travelling merchants. A day in this world was filled with labour, quiet, repetitive, physical. There were no weekends, no holidays beyond religious festivals or seasonal markers. Children learned by doing, not by reading. The spoken word carried power, and memory was revered. Laws were recited from memory at assemblies. Genealogies were taught by parents and grandparents. A person's reputation, not their written record, defined their legacy. And yet, despite the difficulty, the world was not joyless. Songs were sung, riddles were traded, wooden toys were carved. Love poems were composed, sometimes scrawled in runes on bits of bone or stone. Evenings were filled with quiet storytelling, with elders passing down tales of gods and heroes beside the firelight, the smell of tar, smoke, and wool thick in the air. This was not a world of constant conquest. It was a world of constant preparation. To live here was to work, to wait, and to hold on to what little one had through dark winters, lean summers, and long silences between harvests. And for all its myths and violence, the Viking Age was, at its core, a society of farmers. Ritual was embedded in the ordinary. Even among the silence of daily labour, belief shaped behaviour. Before the first furrow was turned in spring, a handful of grain might be offered to the earth, quietly, without ceremony. A carved wooden figure near the hearth, a god, a guardian, or simply an ancestor, watched over meals and sleep. These were not grand acts of devotion, but small gestures of trust in forces beyond control. The gods of the Norse world were not distant ideals. They were woven into weather, into success and failure, into births that survived and fields that failed. Thor guarded travellers and farmers. Freya blessed the fertility of both people and land. Odin was more complicated, associated with wisdom, war, and sacrifice, often feared as much as revered. Freya offered love and magic, but also chose half the dead to join her hall. There was no sacred book, no priestly hierarchy. Belief lived in oral tradition and practical observance, passed from one generation to the next, around fires and across fjords. Religious rites varied between families and regions, but one pattern remained. Offerings were given where need was greatest. These gifts, called blots, ranged from simple bowls of ale poured onto the ground to the slaughtering of animals for feast and favour. At the turn of seasons, especially during Yule or midsummer, larger communal gatherings were held. Animals were sacrificed, their blood sprinkled on people and structures as a blessing, while the meat was cooked and shared in ritual meals. Every part of the animal was used. Nothing was wasted, not the meat, nor the hide, nor the gesture. Sacred groves, rivers, or stones were common focal points for these acts. There were no temples in most rural areas. A tree that had seen generations of births and deaths, or a boulder untouched since the last glacier, could carry the weight of sanctity. In some areas, such as Uppsala in Sweden, central sanctuaries existed, large ceremonial sites where kings and jarls gathered for more formal rituals. But most worship remained local, woven into the domestic rhythm. The same was true of law. Justice in Viking Age Scandinavia was not dictated by monarchs or enforced by standing armies. Instead, it operated through custom and consensus. At the Thing, an open-air assembly of free men held regularly at set locations. The Thing was both court and parliament. It settled disputes, ratified decisions, and interpreted traditional law. Each region had its own thing, and larger ones existed for broader areas. Some met every few weeks, others only a few times a year. Proceedings were public, often held at specific landmarks, a hill, a grove, or a ring of standing stones. Attendance was an obligation for land-owning free men. They came armed, not for battle, but because the right to bear weapons marked one's status as a freeman. Disputes were brought forward, property boundaries, theft, insults, injuries, sometimes killings. There were no jails. Instead, the law sought restitution. The most common resolution was vergild, a man's price, paid in silver or goods to compensate for harm. The amount varied by the status of the injured party. A free man's hand, lost in an accident or a fight, carried a higher price than a thrall's. For a killing, the compensation could be massive, and if refused or unpaid, a blood feud might erupt. Oaths were sacred currency in these gatherings. Sworn on rings or relics, they bound men more tightly than written contracts. A false oath carried shame and risked outlawry, a sentence of exile that removed a person's protection under law, making them fair game for anyone. In tight-knit communities, one's word was more than a personal matter, it reflected on the entire kin group. Kinship determined much of life's structure. A person's name, inheritance, and legal standing were tied to their family. Honour, too, was collective. An insult to one member might require a response from the whole household. This made conflict both delicate and dangerous. While law aimed to contain violence, it often depended on mutual restraint more than enforcement. Vengeance was real, but so was negotiation. Gender roles were sharply defined, yet not without nuance. Men typically dominated political and legal spaces, while women controlled the domestic sphere. Within that domain, women wielded real authority. The keys to the food store, the money chest, and the loom were not symbolic. They signalled the woman's role as keeper of the household economy. Inheritance laws permitted daughters to receive property, especially if no sons survived. Widows often managed farms. A woman wronged could bring a case to the Thing, not in all regions, and not always equally, but enough to suggest that rights, while unequal, were not non-existent. Marriage was a practical alliance, negotiated between families. The union created bonds between households, strengthened trade ties, or settled disputes. Dowries were common: livestock, cloth, or silver offered by the bride's family. In return, the groom's family often paid a mundre, a bride price. The woman joined her husband's household, but retained some rights to her dowry. Divorce was possible, particularly for women in Norway and Iceland. Grounds included neglect, abuse, or failure to provide. Divorce did not carry stigma, though remarriage was often expected. Children were welcomed, but infant mortality was high. Babies were swaddled in wool, fed goat's milk if the mother could not nurse, and named during a small ceremony several days after birth. Until then, the child was not considered fully part of the household, an unspoken acknowledgement of the risk of early death. Names often honoured ancestors, and naming traditions sometimes alternated across generations, creating a rhythm of memory within the family. Burial practices reflected both status and belief. Poorer individuals were laid to rest in simple earth graves, wrapped in wool, and buried with a few personal items: a knife, a comb, perhaps a bead or amulet. Wealthier people might be interred in wooden coffins, or even small burial mounds. Men might be buried with weapons or tools, women with spindle whorls, brooches, and household items. In some cases, animals, dogs, horses, even cattle, were sacrificed and buried alongside their owners. Cremation was also common, particularly in earlier centuries of the Viking Age. The ashes might be scattered, placed in an urn, or buried in a mound. In both cremation and inhumation, grave goods suggest a belief in a continued existence, a journey perhaps, or another life where the tools of this world were needed. Elaborate ship burials were rare, reserved for the elite. The most famous examples, like the Oseberg and Gokstad ships found in Norway, included full-sized vessels buried with their owners, filled with goods, animals, and even sacrificed attendants. These ceremonies required enormous resources and community participation. Most people could only witness such events, not take part in them. Beyond the grave, belief diverged. Some thought of Valhalla, a warrior's hall presided over by Odin, reserved for those who died bravely in battle. Others believed in Folkvanga, Freya's meadow for the noble dead. Still others spoke of Hell, a shadowy underworld ruled by a goddess of the same name. Not a place of punishment, but a final resting place for those who died of sickness or old age. These realms existed more in story than doctrine. The afterlife was not uniform. It varied by story, speaker, and village. Despite this variety, death was not feared in the abstract. It was present everywhere, in childbirth, in fishing expeditions, in winter storms, in feuds. What mattered most was not how one died, but how one lived, whether with honour, with provision for one's household, with a name that others remembered. In every act, from sowing barley to settling disputes, there was an awareness of legacy. Oral tradition preserved history far more effectively than writing. Names, alliances, wrongs and rights were memorized and repeated. A story told in one longhouse might travel across fjords, preserved by skalds, poet-historians, whose verses carried genealogies, victories, and warnings. Even the landscape was remembered this way. A hill might be named for a tragic duel, a fjord for a drowned ship, a stone path for a wedding procession long past. In a world where most people travelled by foot or boat, such memory mapping was both cultural and practical. It bound people not only to one another, but to place. These stories were not just entertainment, they were tools. A skald could sharpen a reputation or soften a feud. A verse well placed might honour a dead father, insult a rival, or woo a prospective bride. Poetry was not merely decoration, it was influence. And in this way history lived in the firelight, passed from mouth to mouth, from one smoke-filled longhouse to the next. Reputation travelled as quickly as ships, and far more enduringly. In societies without paper or printing presses, where contracts were spoken and not written, a person's name was their strongest currency. A man known for fairness or courage might be welcomed into another farmstead, given food or shelter with few questions. One known for theft or cowardice might find doors shut, even in the dead of winter. This attention to honour meant that everyday behaviour was carefully observed and remembered. Hospitality, for example, was not merely a matter of kindness. It was a moral duty, one of the most sacred obligations a household could uphold. A traveller, even a stranger, could expect to be offered a seat, a bowl of broth or ale, and a place near the hearth. The length of stay depended on status and necessity, but refusal to host was seen as shameful unless the guest had violated custom or kin. Feasting, too, was deeply entwined with honour. These were not everyday occurrences. They took effort and stores of food. But when held, they marked rites of passage, seasonal transitions, or important agreements. A well-hosted feast could elevate a family's standing for years. Mead, ale, dried meats, boiled grains, and sometimes rare fruits or imported spices might be served, depending on the host's wealth. The drinking of toasts, the order of seating, and the public recitation of lineage were all carefully orchestrated. No act during a feast was without weight. In these gatherings, skalds played their part, reciting sagas or composing verses that praised the host, remembered ancestors, or mocked enemies in veiled insults. Their verses preserved the memory of local disputes, heroic deeds, and even weather events that marked a good or bad harvest. They spoke not only of the gods and great voyages, but of ordinary life, a failed marriage, a stolen pig, a neighbour's boastful son who had never held a sword. News also spread in these moments. Although most settlements were small and far apart, Scandinavia was not isolated. Through trading routes and seafaring, even a remote fjord community might hear within weeks of a battle in Francia, or a new king in the British Isles. Merchants carried not only goods but stories. A silver coin stamped with an Arabic inscription might sit beside a woman's brooch in a northern longhouse, and no one would question it. Silk might arrive wrapped around a blade, passed hand to hand from Kiev to Birka, never worn but treasured. The trading world of the Viking Age was vast. From the 9th century onward, Scandinavian merchants travelled and settled far beyond the lands of modern Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Westward, they reached the British Isles, Ireland, and eventually Iceland and Greenland. Southward, they interacted with the Carolingian Empire, the Kingdom of the Franks, and even parts of the Islamic world via Andalusia. Eastward, they followed river systems through what is now Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, reaching Byzantium and the Caliphate. But most people never left their home valley. They learned of these places only through travellers' accounts, passing merchants, or returning raiders whose tales were filtered through exaggeration and time. And for every man who sailed to Miklagard, Constantinople, hundreds stayed behind to tend goats, repair fences, and pass winters measuring barley in their palm before pouring it into the cooking pot. The coastal villages were more likely to be touched by the outside world. There, long ships arrived not only with warriors, but with traders, craftsmen, and sometimes enslaved people. The economy of the Viking Age was deeply intertwined with the trade and movement of enslaved individuals. Captured during raids or sold in distant markets, these people might end up in the service of a jarl's household or farm, working alongside thralls born into bondage. Slavery was not racial, but it was systematic. Enslaved people had limited rights, could be bought or sold, and had no legal standing unless granted freedom by their masters. Some worked in fields, others inside homes. A few became craftsmen, boat builders, or even managers of estates. Manumission, freedom granted by the owner, was a known practice, and some freed thralls established families and acquired property. But most remained property, their lives governed by the choices of others. Social stratification was visible in subtle ways. A wealthier farmer's longhouse might be longer, with better timber and tighter seams. Their livestock pens larger. Their cloaks dyed a richer shade of red or blue, their knives fitted with bronze rather than bone. Even grave goods reflected this. More beads, finer brooches, sometimes imported pottery or silver coin. Yet status could shift. A particularly hard winter, a failed harvest, or a death in the family could reduce a household to near thrall conditions within a year. Conversely, a successful marriage, a trade windfall, or a timely alliance could elevate a family from obscurity. The physical environment shaped much of this vulnerability. Winters were long and unforgiving. Snowfall could trap a household for days. Avalanches and landslides occurred near steep valleys. Flooding from spring melts could destroy stored grain or sweep away cattle. Famine was not constant, but neither was it rare. Communities stored dried fish, smoked meats, and ale in clay jars or wooden casks. But spoilage, infestation, or theft could turn one bad season into catastrophe. When hardship came, people turned first to kin, then to neighbours, and finally to gods. There were no poorhouses, but neither was there structured charity. Pity was rare, mutual obligation took its place. A man whose roof collapsed in a snowstorm might receive timber from neighbours, just as he would be expected to return labour during harvest. But a family who gave nothing in good years would find little offered in bad ones. Despite the harshness, there was celebration when the season allowed it. At solstices and equinoxes, at harvests and weddings, people sang. Children played games with carved figures, or tossed stones in ice-melted puddles. Women embroidered bright bands onto dull wool sleeves, and men carved handles for tools with animals whose elegance they'd never seen firsthand. Lions, griffins, camels, learned only from stories and art passed through 100 hands. These were the quiet richnesses of the Viking world. Not plunder, not conquest, but survival adorned with memory. The smell of tarred boats, the rasp of stone on scythe, the warmth of a child's breath in a shared bed in winter. And when darkness fell, long and early in the north, it was not fear that filled the houses, but endurance. The understanding that the same frost that killed the crops also preserved the meat, that the same isolation that silenced villages also protected them, that the same ocean which took sons away also returned them, sometimes with stories no one would believe. Wood was the most important material in the Scandinavian world, not just for buildings and boats, but for nearly every tool and household item. Axes carved beams, shaped planks, trimmed poles, and split firewood. From birch and pine to oak and ash, every type of tree had a role. Some woods were prized for flexibility, used in the curved ribs of boats or the long handles of spears. Others were chosen for strength, ideal for doorposts, cartwheels, and the walls of longhouses. Carpentry was a respected skill, while most households knew enough to repair a fence or replace a tool handle. True craftsmen, the boat builders, wheelwrights and joiners, were sought after in every community. They worked by eye, not by blueprint, shaping wood with iron tools that had changed little in centuries: adzes, planes, chisels and augers. Nails were expensive, so wooden pegs, dovetail joints and bindings made from animal sinew were more common. A well-built cart or chest might be passed down for generations. Inside the longhouse, wooden objects filled every corner. Beds, stools, benches and tables were simple in design, but functional. Cupboards and chests stored clothing, tools or food supplies. Bowls were often turned on simple lathes, sometimes decorated with incised lines or paint. Spoons, ladles and plates were carved by hand. The average household might have a few ceramic vessels, mostly for storage, but daily eating and drinking happened from wood, bone or horn. Iron was the other indispensable material, though far less common. Every tool required it. Knives were used in nearly every task, from food preparation to leatherworking. Even children carried small utility knives by the time they could walk steadily. A single iron axe, sharp and well kept, could define a family's prosperity. Cutting wood, clearing land, even defending livestock from wolves. Blacksmiths were found in larger settlements and occasionally travelled between farms. Smelting required charcoal and high temperatures, and much of the iron used locally came from bog ore, mined from marshes and streams, then smelted in clay furnaces. Weapons were not common in most homes. Spears and bows were used for hunting, but swords were rare, often imported or inherited. Shield making was a local craft. Lightweight wooden rounds covered in leather with an iron boss in the centre. Helmets and chainmail existed, but they were expensive and usually reserved for those with wealth or military ties. Most farmers would defend their home with a hunting spear, a heavy axe, or whatever was at hand. Textile production filled the spaces between heavier tasks. Spinning, weaving, and sewing were done year-round, particularly by women and girls. Wool was cleaned, carded, spun into thread using drop spindles, then woven into cloth on upright looms. Linen, made from flax, required soaking, beating, and drying before it could be processed. More labour-intensive than wool, but cooler to wear in warmer months. Weaving was slow and deliberate. A family might produce only a few new garments per year, so repairs and patching were constant. Clothing was layered and practical. Underclothes were usually made from linen, worn beneath woolen tunics or dresses. Cloaks, fastened with brooches, provided warmth. Shoes were soft-soled leather, stitched with waxed thread and tied at the ankle. Foot wrappings were often added for warmth. Mittens, caps and stockings were common in colder seasons, knitted or woven from whatever material could be spared. Cooking was done over the central hearth, which doubled as the only real light source during winter. Meals were slow, based on what was preserved, stored, or gathered. A typical day's food might include a barley porridge cooked with whey or milk, flavoured with herbs or bits of dried apple. Bread was baked on stones near the fire, dense and coarse, made from rye or barley flour, occasionally sweetened with honey if bees had been generous that year. Fish featured prominently, especially along coasts and rivers. Cod was dried on racks, herring pickled in brine, and shellfish gathered and boiled in large pots. Meat, when available, came from sheep, goats, pigs, or hunted game like deer and hare. Salt was precious and used sparingly. Smoking and drying were the more common means of preservation. Butter and cheese were made from goat or cow's milk when available, though fresh dairy was more common in the summer months. Vegetables included turnips, onions, leeks, and cabbage. Wild greens were gathered when in season, nettles, sorrel, and dandelion among them. Berries, particularly lingonberries, cloudberries, and bilberries, were eaten fresh or dried. Mushrooms were gathered, but with caution. Fungi were poorly understood, and many were avoided altogether. Storage was constant concern. Root vegetables were kept in pits or buried under straw in dry sheds. Meat and fish hung from rafters in the smokehouse. Grain was stored in chests or silos built from planks, sometimes elevated to keep out rodents. Mice and insects were an ever-present threat. Cats, welcomed for their hunting ability, were often kept indoors or allowed to roam freely. Dogs, too, were part of the household. Not pets in the modern sense, but guardians, herders, and companions. Lighting at night came from oil lamps, torches, or the fire itself. Lamps were carved from stone or shaped from clay, filled with fish oil or animal fat, and lit with simple wicks. They smoked heavily and required constant tending. In winter, the long dark hours were passed in quiet work, mending clothes, carving tools, spinning thread. Singing was common. So was storytelling, tales of gods and ghosts, of journeys and justice. The layout of the farmstead reflected the need for compact efficiency. The longhouse formed the centre, flanked by sheds, barns, and fenced paddocks. A manure pile stood nearby, scraped and spread onto fields as fertiliser. The well was usually close, sometimes shared with neighbours. Chickens roamed freely, scratching through hay and dung. Children played near the animals, often barefoot even in cool weather, their games mirroring adult labour, mock fishing, pretend threshing, carving small boats from scrap wood. Paths between buildings were packed dirt or laid with timber if the ground was soft. Wheels left ruts that filled with water. In heavy rain, the entire yard could become a field of mud, and wooden walkways were used to reach the door. Roofs leaked. Walls shifted. Repairs were constant. A home that stood for 50 years was not untouched by time. It was patched, rethatched, its beams braced and corners reinforced. It changed with the family it housed. Water management was rudimentary, but functional. Gutters carved from logs directed runoff away from walls. Barrels caught rain for washing. Bathing, when it happened, used heated water poured over the body or immersion in rivers and streams. Sauna-like bathhouses, especially in Sweden and Finland, provided steam and warmth in cold weather. A luxury for most, but occasionally shared among families. Illness was treated with herbs, prayer, and experience. There were no physicians, but most households had a healer or midwife. Women, especially older ones, preserved knowledge of treatments for fever, pain, infection, and childbirth. Willow bark for pain, yarrow for bleeding, garlic for infection. Charms and chants often accompanied these remedies, not always out of belief, but tradition. Childbirth was dangerous. Women gave birth at home, attended by female relatives or neighbours. If complications arose, there was little to be done. Stillborn children were buried quickly, often without ceremony. Those who survived were swaddled, fed, and named in a small rite held several days after birth. Naming was serious business, often reflecting ancestors or intended virtues. A child might carry the name of a grandfather, an aunt, or a long-dead hero. Names were said to carry echoes, shaping the fate of the bearer. Education was informal. Boys learned to hunt, fish, carve, and farm by following their fathers and uncles. Girls learned to cook, spin, sew, and manage a household by doing the same. There were no schools, but memory was trained rigorously. Children were expected to recite genealogies, farm duties, and proverbs by heart. Runes might be carved for fun, but literacy was rare and not required. What mattered most was skill and the ability to survive. Even the youngest children had chores: feeding chickens, gathering kindling, carrying water. Play existed, but only in the spaces between usefulness. Toys were simple: carved animals, clay figures, whistles, and wooden swords. Games of strength or speed were encouraged, particularly for boys, who were expected to grow into defenders, workers, and eventually householders. The seasons gave rhythm to everything. Spring brought thaw and planting. Summer meant long days, haymaking, and for some, travel by boat. Autumn was harvest, slaughter, and storage. Winter was quiet, labour-intensive in different ways: repairing tools, weaving, storytelling, surviving. Every season prepared for the next. And through it all, the house stood, low and dark against the landscape. Not just a shelter, but a record of effort, adaptation, and memory. Built by hand, warmed by fire, it held the weight of everything its people carried: their labour, their fears, their small joys, and their quiet, hard-won peace. The structure of the home varied depending on geography. In the lowlands of Denmark, long houses were often broad and gently curved along their length, with post holes set deep in the ground to withstand the shifting earth. In the mountainous fjords of Norway, homes were more compact, their timber frames reinforced with stacked stone at the base, better suited to steep, wet terrain. On the Swedish plains, houses stretched longer still, sometimes over 20 metres in length, with stables or animal pens connected at one end. Livestock and humans living under the same roof, divided only by a low wooden wall. In Iceland and the Faroe Islands, where timber was scarce, turf houses became common. These buildings were half buried into the landscape, their thick grass-covered walls insulating against fierce winds and prolonged snow. Inside, smoke drifted slowly out through openings in the roof, the air heavy but warm. Light was scarce in these turf homes, but heat was preserved like a secret. The walls themselves held the memory of fire. As winter approached, daily life slowed, but it did not stop. Outside tasks were condensed into short bursts during the few usable hours of daylight. Wood was split and stacked. Tools were sharpened. Animals were fed, and their pens mucked out. Ice had to be broken in water troughs. Food was rotated in storage, checked for mould or spoilage. Dried meat and fish were soaked before use, boiled into soups thickened with root vegetables and leftover grains. Ale, brewed in autumn, was rationed carefully. The strongest batches were saved for Yule. Winter sharpened dependence. No household, however self-sufficient, could survive in isolation. Roads became impassable. Travel slowed to sled or foot. Neighbours helped neighbours with large tasks: slaughtering livestock, building fences, digging out snow-blocked paths. A broken leg or a failed roof beam was no longer an inconvenience, but a potential catastrophe. In these months, survival was communal. Disputes were postponed. Generosity was noticed. Memory was long. Inside, the longhouse became the world. Generations often lived together: grandparents, parents, children, sometimes cousins or servants. Each had a role. Elders tended to fires, sharpened tools and passed on knowledge. Women wove and sewed by lamplight, patching garments or crafting new ones from wool spun during the fall. Men carved handles for tools, reshaped sled runners, repaired fishing nets, and retied bindings that would need to hold come thaw. Conversations stretched longer in winter. They curled like steam from clay mugs. People sat shoulder to shoulder on the benches built along the longhouse walls, sharing warmth beneath heavy cloaks. Children listened, eyes wide in the firelight, as their elders recited family lines, old stories, proverbs meant to guide as much as entertain. Disagreements happened, of course. In close quarters, tempers could fray, but quarrels were quiet, often handled with a look or a muttered phrase. Full arguments were rare. Space was too limited to allow for distance, and survival too dependent on unity. A cracked relationship could be more dangerous than a cracked beam. Gender roles remained visible, but the lines softened in times of stress. A man might tend to an infant if his wife were ill. A woman might help with slaughter if the men were away. No one had the luxury of idleness, and no job was beneath anyone when the stakes were survival. Children mimicked adults, offering to stir porridge or help mend harnesses. Even small hands had purpose. Despite hardship, there were moments of light. Yule, celebrated at midwinter, was a time of feasting and renewal. The darkest day marked the turning of the sun's path. Green branches were brought inside, symbolizing life's persistence. A special boar or goat might be slaughtered. Ale flowed more freely. Songs filled the smoky air, and laughter rose louder than usual. Gifts were exchanged, simple things, mostly handmade, a carved comb, a new woolen cap, a necklace strung with polished bone. Stories were told late into the night, the fire built high, the doors barred against the wind. Not every home could afford a great feast, but no one was left entirely out. Villages, hamlets, and neighbouring farms shared what they could. 1 year's generosity was next year's insurance. Those who gave when they could were remembered when they could not. Generosity was not merely virtue, it was strategy. When spring finally began to return, it came subtly. The sun lingered longer by minutes each day. Meltwater trickled along familiar grooves in the frozen earth. Birds returned, ravens first, then gulls, then smaller songbirds with voices that broke the silence of snow. Ice cracked and slipped from rooftops. Tools were brought out again, not with celebration, but with readiness. Fields were cleared. Sleds were set aside for carts. Nets were untangled and checked for holes. Seed grain, carefully stored in sacks through the winter, was inspected for rot. Some years the sowing was lean. Too much had been eaten, or lost. In those years, prayers to the gods were louder, and people watched the weather like it might answer. With the snow retreating, travel resumed. Men walked or rode to market towns or local thing sites. They brought hides, tools, preserved fish, wool or antler to trade. Women brought cloth, dairy goods, herbs, and sometimes their own crafted jewellery. Beads strung from glass or bone, bronze pendants, dyed wool cords. Trade didn't require coin. Barter was the rule. A dozen eggs might be exchanged for a length of rope. A half bucket of barley for a wooden spoon. In coastal regions, silver did appear. Coins clipped from Arabic dirhams or Frankish currency, not for spending, but for weighing. Traders brought goods from abroad. Glass beads from the Baltic. Pottery from Frisia. Silk and spices that had passed through half a dozen hands since leaving Byzantium. News travelled along with goods. A king had died. A fleet had landed in Ireland. A jarl's daughter had married into a neighbouring clan. Each story carried in memory, shaped slightly by each teller. For communities so physically isolated, the world felt far more connected than modern assumptions might suggest. Every journey held risk. Rivers swelled with meltwater. Snowmelt flooded trails. Wolves still prowled in the forests, and a broken cart axle or twisted ankle could mean days lost. But journeys were taken all the same, necessary for trade, law, marriage, or simple reaffirmation of ties. A man who disappeared for a week might return with salt, a new axe head, or news of a cousin thought long gone. As the earth warmed, daily life returned to its faster rhythm. Seeds were planted in rows by hand. Children scattered to chase livestock or gather early herbs. Women scrubbed garments in the stream, laying them on sunlit rocks to dry. Thatched roofs were checked and patched. Boats were hauled from winter storage, their hulls scraped and sealed with pine tar. The longhouse, too, adapted. Layers of clothing were peeled away. The central fire was left to die earlier in the evening. Doorways were opened for air. The smell of smoke gave way to damp wood and fresh soil. In the evenings, people sat outside when they could, sharpening tools or mending harnesses, squinting into the late-setting sun. The cold was not forgotten. It never was, but its grip had loosened. Seasons marked time not by calendar, but by action. Lambing season, sowing season, midsummer, first harvest. These became the rhythm by which people measured their own lives. A boy was now strong enough to lead the oxen. A girl could card her own wool. An elder no longer rose early, but still offered counsel. Time passed not by days, but by duties taken up or passed on. And through it all, the land endured. Fields, forests, fjords, not untouched but carefully used, a path worn by generations. A stone placed where a storm broke a wall. A tree marked with a carving too old to read, but never removed. The world was not a backdrop, but a participant, shaping, sheltering, resisting, forgiving. By early summer, the landscape transformed. Snowmelt had drained into rivers now running clear and strong. Grass grew tall along field edges and footpaths, thick enough to brush the knees of passing herders. Wildflowers marked the hillsides in soft clusters. Blue gentian, yellow buttercup, purple cranesbill. What had been white and brown only weeks before was now green, urgent, and full of work. This was the busiest season of the year. Labour intensified across every part of the farmstead, and every person, no matter their age or strength, had a part to play. There was no luxury of delay. The summer sun, generous though it seemed, moved quickly through the northern sky. In just a few months, it would begin to slip again, and all that had not been sown, gathered, cut, or dried would be lost to winter. Fields that had been seeded with barley and rye were weeded by hand. There were no ploughs pulled by machines, no irrigation channels to manage rainfall. Instead, families moved together across the soil, bending low, clearing rocks, breaking up clods, and watching the clouds with guarded hope. A dry summer could burn crops. Too much rain, and the roots might rot before they could bear grain. Haymaking began early in June in warmer regions, later in cooler inland valleys. Grass was cut with long-handled scythes, the blades hammered and honed to slice rather than tear. The cuttings were left to dry in the sun, then turned with wooden rakes to prevent mould. It was back-breaking work, done under full sun and with biting insects clouding around every bare ankle and wrist. But the work was sacred. Without hay, there would be no livestock in winter. Without livestock, no milk, no meat, no leather, no manure to fertilise next year's fields. Once dry, the hay was bundled and carried in armloads to raised sheds or open barns. In coastal areas, seaweed was sometimes collected and mixed into animal fodder. Goats, less picky than cattle, could subsist on almost anything. But cattle were more delicate, and their upkeep was one of the clearest signs of wealth. A man with 2 milk cows had security. A man with 5 was called prosperous. Sheep and goats grazed in the uplands, watched by older children or adolescents. Herding was lonely work, but not dull. Children used the time to practice carving, weaving, or composing little songs. They learned the habits of their animals, who strayed, who led, who needed help lambing or kidding. They learned the shape of the land, the locations of springs and shaded hollows, the places where wolves might slip through thickets. Dogs helped when available, sharp-eyed and loyal, trained to respond to whistles or clicks of the tongue. Back at the farm, dairying became a daily ritual. Milk was collected morning and evening, poured through cloth to strain out straw or hair, then churned into butter or set aside to ferment into skyr, a tangy curdled product similar to yogurt. Cheese was pressed into small wheels or packed into ceramic jars and sealed with wax or fat. These tasks were constant and required careful attention. Milk soured quickly in the warmth, and once ruined, it could not be reclaimed. Fishing, though often thought of as a spring and autumn task, remained vital in summer. Nets were cast at dawn or dusk in the fjords, rivers or lakes. Catches were smoked or dried immediately, sometimes salted if the household had traded for enough. Salmon, trout and herring were especially prized. Eels were also common in some regions, fat, oily and able to survive out of water for hours, making them easier to transport. Hunting continued year-round, but was less emphasised in the summer when livestock and crops took priority. Still, a good hunter might bring in hare, grouse, or the occasional deer, supplementing the household's meat stores and providing leather or sinew for tools. Traps were often set along known animal paths, checked regularly during other work. The summer also brought bees. Hives were kept near settlements, and careful observation of their behaviour guided harvests. Honey was one of the few sources of sugar, used to sweeten porridge or preserve fruit. It also formed the basis of mead, a fermented drink made with water, honey and herbs. Stronger than ale, it was saved for special occasions, weddings, rites of passage, or the arrival of guests who deserved honour. With abundance came celebration. Midsummer, marked by the longest day of the year, was a time of communal gathering. Though exact traditions varied, it was generally a moment of pause amid labour. Feasts were held outdoors, often in clearings or along riverbanks. Fires were lit, dances performed, and toasts made to the gods and to each other. Green branches were twisted into wreaths. Songs were sung in rounds, simple and repetitive, meant more for rhythm than performance. Marriages often took place at midsummer. The timing was practical, dowries could be paid in livestock and produce, and new couples could settle into work together before winter. Ceremonies were not standardized, but generally involved an exchange of gifts, shared food, oaths witnessed by kin, and perhaps a ritual blessing at a local grove or spring. Rings were rare. Brooches or belts were more common tokens of union. Children born from these unions were named and woven into the social fabric of the household. Inheritance was passed patrilineally, but maternal kinship remained important. Godparents did not exist in the Christian sense, but certain figures, elders, respected neighbours, warriors of renown, might be asked to bless or mentor the child, binding them symbolically into broader networks. With summer came traders, arriving by boat or overland trails. Their approach was marked not just by the sound of hooves or oars, but by the buzz of anticipation. They brought goods unavailable locally, quernstones from distant quarries, whetstones from Gotland, bronze and glass ornaments, carved antler combs, salt, even linen or silk if the journey had been long and prosperous. In exchange they sought furs, wool, amber, dried fish, and sometimes slaves. Markets were informal but understood. A grassy clearing, a flat rock by a river bend, a junction of trails. No permanent stalls. Goods laid out on woven mats or in baskets. Trade was swift and personal. Weights were tested by hand. Values were debated. Trust was essential. And memory was everything. A trader who cheated once would find no customers the next season. These encounters broadened horizons. Even those who never left their home valley learned about distant cities. Haithabu, Birka, Dublin, even Miklagard. Places filled with towers, horses, coloured stone, and strange laws. News of kings, wars, and storms passed mouth to mouth, blending fact and rumour, until even the quietest farmstead felt slightly more connected to the wider world. Still, for most, the focus remained close to home. Roofs needed patching. Tools needed oiling. Spindles turned constantly. Sails were sewn and mended. Salt was boiled down from seawater in clay pans. Dung was collected and spread across the fields. These were the acts that underpinned the possibility of survival. No feast could replace them. By late summer, preparations began for the harvest. Sickles were checked for rust. Grain stores were measured to make space. The first ripe berries were dried for winter stews. Apples, if the farmstead had them, were buried in pits lined with straw to keep them from rotting. Beans were picked and laid on racks to dry. Turnips were pulled and stored in earthen cellars. The land gave much, but only if managed carefully. Fields were rotated, though not by formal plan. Experience guided when to let a plot rest. Ash from the hearth was spread on poor soil. Water channels were dug in marshy ground. Fences were reinforced to keep out wild boar or deer. At every stage, success required cooperation. Between people, between generations, between memory and foresight. And in this brief season of warmth, light lingered past bedtime. Children stayed outside until their feet were cold. Elders sat in doorways, watching clouds. Lovers met in secret near the woods. The night was never fully dark, and the horizon never fully empty. Even in a world of hard limits, summer offered the illusion of endlessness. By late August, the sun no longer lingered as it once had. Days grew shorter, shadows lengthened across the fields, and the morning air returned with a bite sharp enough to leave dew on the doorposts. The great urgency of harvest season had begun. Barley and rye, staple grains in much of Scandinavia, were now tall, yellowed, and heavy-headed. They swayed with each breeze like a sea of promise and fragility. Timing was everything. If harvested too early, the grain would be soft and ruin easily in storage. Too late, and the heads might shatter in the wind or rot from a sudden rain. Families walked the fields daily, inspecting by touch and sound, the husk dry enough to snap, the stalk ready to give. Harvesting was done by hand. Sickles, their iron blades carefully sharpened in the evenings before work, were used to cut the stalks close to the ground. Labourers moved slowly across the rows, bending and gathering, stacking sheaves in tidy bundles bound with straw or grass. Everyone participated, men, women, children and elders, each taking a portion of the field. Even toddlers were sent to chase birds away or gather stray stalks. There were no idle hands. Once cut, the grain was left in the field for a day or two, drying under canvas if needed, then carried back to the farm on carts or sleds. The threshing came next, breaking the seed from the husk. This was done with flails, long wooden poles connected by a flexible joint, beaten rhythmically against the grain. It was dusty, exhausting work. The chaff floated everywhere, clinging to hair and skin. Children often took part, working in pairs or groups under watchful eyes. After threshing came winnowing. Baskets of grain were poured slowly into the wind or across wide cloths. The lighter chaff blew away, the heavier grain fell. In calm weather, this was done indoors using fans or scooped hands. The final product, cleaned kernels, was measured into sacks, barrels, or wooden bins. A portion was kept aside for seed next year, some for trade, some for taxes or rent, and the rest for food. There was no counting by exact weight. Instead, standardized measurements, usually the volume of a known vessel, guided estimation. Each family knew how much they needed to survive the winter. The shortfall was felt immediately. A thin harvest meant less bread, less ale, fewer animals fed, and fewer hands kept warm. Preservation began in earnest. Grains were dried further over low fires, then stored in cool, dark buildings. Bread was baked in dense, durable loaves and dried on racks. Cheese and skyr were sealed in clay or wrapped in waxed linen. Meat, now slaughtered from aging livestock, was salted and smoked. Fish hung on drying racks in long rows, tails fluttering in the breeze like faded banners. Nothing was wasted. Even bones were boiled for stock, and hides cured for clothing or boots. Autumn was also the season of slaughter. Animals that could not be fed through the winter were butchered. This included older sheep, weak or unproductive goats, and pigs that had been fattened through the summer. The slaughter itself was both practical and ritual. Prayers were whispered over the blade. A portion of blood might be poured at the threshold or near a tree known to house spirits. The rest was used, cooked into sausages, thickened into pudding, dried and stored. Work filled the hours, but so did tension. Tempers ran short as fatigue set in. A broken tool or spoiled barrel could undo days of effort. Children became quiet as they watched the adults move faster, sleep less, and speak more curtly. Still, small joys found space between tasks: a ripe apple, a newly carved spoon, a shared drink after the grain was stored. These moments were not luxuries, they were essential. Clothing was mended and layered. Woolen undergarments were brought out from storage. Fur-lined cloaks and mittens were checked for holes. Boots were oiled. Snowshoes, for those in the north, were inspected and retied with new sinew. Households took stock not just of supplies, but of each other. Who had grown frail? Who had reached adulthood? Who would need help when the cold came in full? Roof beams were tested. Doors were sealed with moss or waxed cloth to keep out drafts. Firewood was stacked higher against the wall. Peat bricks were gathered in tighter piles. Animal pens were reinforced. A week of bad weather could freeze troughs, collapse fences, or trap families indoors. Anticipation of need, of scarcity, of silence sharpened every task. And yet, even amid the preparation, autumn had its beauty. Hills flamed in red and gold. Smoke curled from rooftops at dusk in long, even plumes. The air smelled of dried apples, new leather, peat fire, and wood smoke. Geese flew overhead in staggered lines, calling out as they passed. In the forest, elk and deer moved more boldly, their coats thickening in advance of the snow. Communal gatherings marked the end of the harvest. In some regions, these became formal festivals. In others, they were simply shared meals. Several families gathering in one longhouse to eat what would not last the winter. Brewed ale, now fully fermented, was poured freely. Dried meats, baked breads, berries preserved in honey, and thick soups made from root vegetables filled wooden bowls. Stories were told again, louder now, with the confidence of full bellies. Children performed skits or songs taught to them by older siblings. Skalds, if present, recited poems honouring the harvest, the ancestors, or recent events, sometimes composed just for the occasion. Jokes were made at neighbours' expense, carefully crafted not to cause offence. Even feuds for a night might be paused. In this window between abundance and austerity, people reaffirmed their place in the order of things. Oaths were renewed, marriages announced, births and deaths recorded in memory. A woman might pass her necklace to a daughter. A man might offer his old belt knife to a nephew. These gestures stitched the community together, not through wealth, but through continuity. As the days grew colder, candles were made. Tallow was melted down and poured into moulds. Wicks were braided from flax or wool. These candles gave off little light, but were better than the smoke-heavy oil lamps of winter. The first snow was greeted not with joy, but with resolve. Doors were shut earlier. Voices lowered. The pace of life shifted inwards. And so, the season turned. Not with a ceremony, but with 100 tiny movements. The last apple stored. The final fish smoked. The ground freezing just enough to refuse the spade. Breath visible in the morning. The sound of the forest changing, quieter, slower, as if holding its breath. In these final days before winter, every task became a kind of hope. Hope that the preparation had been enough, that the bonds between kin would hold, and that whatever the cold took, it would leave behind the strength to begin again. By midwinter, the landscape had hardened into silence. Snow lay heavy on rooftops, muffling the sounds of footsteps and voices. Trees, stripped bare, stood like black ribs against the grey sky. The sun rose low and late, casting little warmth before vanishing again behind the hills. In the far north, it disappeared altogether for weeks at a time, leaving only a dim twilight at midday. In this season, time moved slowly, marked more by routine than by light. Inside the longhouse, life contracted. The structure itself was now the centre of every activity. Work, rest, meals, and memory all contained within a few wooden walls. The hearth burned almost constantly, its fire a narrow column of heat and light in the otherwise smoky gloom. Everything radiated from that central source. People slept near it, worked around it, and oriented their lives according to its reach. The closer one sat, the warmer and more visible the world became. Wood was burned sparingly. Even with stores gathered during the summer and autumn, fuel had to last until the thaw. The fire was banked at night with ash to hold the coals until morning. Peat and dried dung supplemented the supply when available. Cooking was done in a single cauldron or pot, suspended over the coals or nestled into the embers. Meals were boiled slowly, soups thickened with dried legumes, bits of meat or preserved fish, and grain saved from harvest. On lean days, only broth was served. Clothing was never removed fully indoors. Everyone wore layers, woolen tunics, cloaks, mittens, and caps, even while seated around the fire. Foot coverings were crucial. In many regions, people wore wrappings made of wool or felt, tied with strips of leather and tucked into soft-soled boots. Fur-lined garments were common among the better off, particularly for infants and elders who suffered more quickly from the cold. Daylight, when it came, was put to quick use. Ice had to be broken in troughs for animals. Pens were cleared of frozen waste. If the snow was soft enough, it was packed down to make footpaths between outbuildings. Carts were left idle. Sleds now served as transport for everything from firewood to water barrels. When the sky was clear, its brightness off the snow could sting the eyes. Some people squinted behind slitted visors made from carved bone or wood. Most animals were kept close to the house, or even within it. A small wooden barrier often divided the human and animal sections of the longhouse. Cattle and goats provided not just milk, but warmth. Their bodies radiated heat, and their presence offered comfort on nights when the wind screamed through the roof beams. Chickens roosted in corners, cats patrolled for rodents, and dogs lay curled near the fire, their ears flicking at every distant sound. Work too moved indoors. Spinning thread, weaving cloth, and mending garments became central tasks. Women sat with baskets of wool, combing and twisting it into fine strands using hand spindles. Finished thread was wound into skeins and later woven into bolts of cloth on upright looms. The rhythm of the shuttle and the creak of the loom were among the few regular sounds in an otherwise quiet house. Men worked wood and bone. They carved handles for knives, spoons, bowls, sled runners and tools. Some turned to ornamentation, etching designs into combs, hilts, or small religious amulets. Ironwork slowed due to the scarcity of fuel, but repairs were still done using bellows and coals when absolutely necessary. Leatherworking, too, became a winter craft, stitching new shoes, repairing belts, or reshaping old gear to fit a growing child. Children helped where they could. They sorted wool, fetched water, cleaned bowls, or tended the fire. In quieter moments, they played with toys, carved animals, small wheeled carts, or bones used as dice or markers. They learned through imitation, watching the adults closely. A child might learn to thread a needle or sharpen a knife, not through instruction, but simply by being nearby for hundreds of quiet hours. Stories filled the evenings. With no written books or formal schooling, the oral tradition kept knowledge alive. Family histories, local legends, and ancient myths were told and retold, shaped slightly by each speaker, but rooted in consistency. A grandfather might recite the tale of how Odin hung from the world tree to learn the runes. A mother might pass on the saga of a woman who tricked a giant and saved her village. Proverbs and riddles were shared to sharpen the mind. Listening was a skill expected of every child. Though daily life was quiet, it was not without risk. Illness struck harder in winter. A cough, untreated, could become fatal. Wounds healed slowly. Foodborne sickness from spoiled stores was feared. There were herbal remedies for many ailments: dried yarrow for wounds, willow bark for fever, garlic for infection. But their effectiveness varied, and they were often in short supply. The loss of an elder, a parent, or even a goat could tip a household into deep hardship. Outside, the landscape changed. The forest fell silent except for crows and the occasional wolf. Animal tracks crossed the snow. Fox, hare, elk, sometimes boar. Hunters ventured out only when necessary, moving slowly on snowshoes or skis fashioned from curved wood. Traps were checked when possible, but most were left until spring. The risk of getting lost, falling through ice, or encountering a predator was too great. The community as a whole became more tightly knit during these months. Visits were rare but significant. A neighbour arriving with news or a loaf of bread was welcomed like a hero. Hospitality remained sacred. Even in scarcity, a visitor was offered food and a place near the fire. Long-term grudges might soften in the face of shared hardship, though feuds never vanished completely. In some regions, especially where Christian influence had begun to seep in through trade or missionary visits, winter brought new rituals. Small chapels or crosses might be tended even during snow, but in most places the old ways held. Families left offerings for the land spirits: a crust of bread, a drop of ale, or a carved token set outside the door. The spirit world felt closer in the dark. Dreams were taken seriously. An owl's call at night might be seen as a sign. Children were warned not to whistle after sunset or speak the names of the dead too loudly. Yet life endured. Laughter still echoed in the longhouse, soft, tired, but sincere. Meals were eaten slowly, not just for warmth, but for comfort. Hands found each other beneath fur blankets. Couples whispered beneath the heavy rhythm of snow against the roof. The night was long, but not empty. And each morning, the fire was rekindled. Smoke rose through the thatch. Water was fetched. The grindstone turned. A child stood a little taller. A tool grew smoother with use. The seasons had not broken anyone yet, and so the work continued. The hardest part of winter was not the cold, it was the waiting. When the snow had already fallen, the food already stored, the animals already penned, and all that could be repaired had been repaired, the days blurred into a slow rhythm of repetition. A full belly was a comfort, but not a distraction. And distraction was rare. The psychological weight of winter in Viking Age Scandinavia was as real as any material hardship. People lived in close quarters, rarely more than a few arms' lengths from one another. There was little privacy, no rooms, no doors, no separate places to go. The fire illuminated all. Disagreements simmered more than they erupted. A misplaced word, a sour look, a forgotten chore. Any of these could echo for days. But isolation wasn't an option. Forgiveness was not a luxury. It was a requirement for peace. Some longhouses had traditions for easing this tension. Storytelling wasn't reserved only for grand tales of gods and giants. Humour, often dry and earthy, softened the edges of daily hardship. Riddles were a favourite pastime, passed between family members or taught to children as a game of cleverness. A particularly good answer could win the last piece of dried apple or the softest spot near the hearth. Superstition filled the cracks left by uncertainty. When a baby cried through the night, it might be said that spirits were jealous. When the wind moaned through the chimney hole, it wasn't merely the weather, it was the Veda, the unseen forces of the forest and mountain. Everyone had a story of hearing footsteps on the roof, or voices outside the walls when no one was there. These beliefs didn't demand strict worship, but they coloured behaviour, offerings left at thresholds, charms sewn into clothing, warnings whispered to children. Dreams were taken seriously. They were often retold in the mornings, interpreted not just for omen, but for comfort. A dream of a storm might be taken as a sign to check the roof again. A dream of a long-dead ancestor could stir both grief and reassurance. People who dreamed vividly were thought to have special sight. Those who never dreamed, or never remembered, were considered either especially grounded or especially stubborn. Yule, celebrated at midwinter, was both a turning point and a mirror. Its rituals offered a sense of renewal, but also reminded people how much of the winter remained. The longest night had passed, yes, but barely. A boar, if the farm could spare one, might be slaughtered for the occasion. Its blood smeared on doorposts or tools, a symbolic blessing. Ale brewed in autumn was opened, shared carefully. Flatbread, smoked fish, dried berries, and cheese rounded out the meal. Gifts, if given, were practical. A carved button, a new pair of mittens, a small wooden idol. After Yule, the wait continued. The snow deepened. The firewood stack shrank. Food was rationed more strictly. In lean years, the meals became thinner. Broth rather than stew, porridge made from bark or dried lichen. No one went hungry all at once. Hunger crept in slowly, a gnawing edge at the stomach, a dull ache behind the eyes. People grew quieter. Children moved less. The old sat longer near the fire. But even in this hardest stretch, the signs of change began. A patch of roof thawed earlier than the rest. The hens clucked louder, sensing the days lengthening by mere minutes. Goats became restless in their stalls. The youngest members of the household began asking questions again. When could they go outside? When would the snow melt? When could they chase the dog again through the thawing pasture? And then, almost imperceptibly, the season began to shift. The ice on the stream thinned. The wind carried a different smell. Less smoke, more earth. Snow slid from the roof in sheets. A crow called from the top of a bare tree, and its voice sounded more curious than cold. Inside the longhouse, people moved with new intention. Tools were inspected for spring. Seed grain was checked. A new pair of shoes was planned for a growing child. Wool was dyed now that the fire could be spared for colour. The walls still shook in the wind. The hearth still burned. But the conversations drifted toward the next season. When to sow? What to trade? Who might travel to the spring thing gathering? The psychological load began to lift. People smiled more. Not broadly, not foolishly. Just slightly. A corner of the mouth. A softer word. An old song hummed again, after being forgotten for months. Children played with more energy. Elders stood more often. The silence of winter had not broken, but it had thinned. No one celebrated too soon. Snow might still fall. A late frost could still kill. But hope returned in practical forms. Bread made with more flour. A second piece of meat. A longer walk outside. Even the animals seemed to sense it, lifting their heads more often, sniffing the air. In this way, the Viking Age household endured its hardest season, not with bold defiance, but with steadiness. Through routine, belief, mutual need, and the careful passing of stories and skills, winter never stopped being difficult. It never stopped being dangerous, but it also never fully won. And by the time the first green returned to the edge of the path, people were ready. Not eager, not naive, but prepared. The darkness had done its work, and now it was time to begin again. Spring arrived slowly, not with warmth, but with water. First came the sound, dripping from the thatch, trickling from the hills, pooling in the ruts between buildings. The snow did not vanish all at once. It receded by inches, revealing patches of sodden brown earth and crushed grass beneath. Boots no longer crunched, they squelched. This thaw marked the beginning of the working year. The ground was not yet ready for planting, but the ice had released its grip, and that was enough. Streams ran faster. Frozen door latches gave way with a creak. For the first time in months, windows, small slits cut in the walls, were opened for air. Smoke no longer clung to every surface. The inside of the longhouse took on the smell of damp wood, drying wool, and freshly scraped hides. The animals responded first. Goats and sheep pushed against the doors of their pens, calling out with hungry insistence. Cattle, lean from winter, stood stiff-legged in the morning light, their breath still steaming. Hens resumed laying with greater regularity. Even the barn cats, absent during much of the winter, reappeared with brighter eyes and more urgency. People moved more freely now. Paths were cleared, carts were unearthed and repaired, and tools were brought out from winter storage. Axes were sharpened again. Ropes were retied and dried. Iron pots were scrubbed of winter soot. Cloaks remained close at hand. Spring was not warm, but the lightness in people's steps betrayed a collective shift. The work ahead was great, but the stillness behind them was greater. This was the season of reckoning. Winter stores were measured not just in what remained, but in what had been lost. Grain bins were inspected, meat barrels sniffed for spoilage. If a family had made it through with food to spare, it meant careful planning, or good fortune. If the shelves were bare, it meant debts would soon follow. Communities remembered who had given and who had needed. Spring rebalanced these accounts, quietly but firmly. The land itself demanded attention. Deadfall from winter storms was cleared. Fences were mended where snow had crushed them. Trees broken by wind were chopped for next year's firewood. The soil, still heavy with melt, was tested by hand, squeezed and crumbled to judge when planting could begin. This decision mattered. Seeds planted too early would rot, too late, and the crop would not mature before the next frost. Men and women worked together to prepare the fields. In some regions, oxen pulled wooden ards, a simple plough that scratched shallow furrows in the earth. In others, digging sticks or hoes were used to break ground by hand. Stones were removed, weeds burned or composted. Ashes from the hearth were spread thinly across the soil. Poor man's fertilizer, rich in potassium. Seaweed, if accessible, was gathered and worked into the dirt. The rhythm of planting was physical, repetitive, and exhausting. Barley was often the first crop sown, resilient, quick to mature, and suited to the short growing season. Rye and oats followed, along with turnips, beans, and onions. In kitchen gardens, women planted herbs and greens, sorrel, leeks, mustard, dill, and sometimes parsley or garlic. Not every household had the luxury of a separate garden, but most managed some small plot, tucked beside the longhouse, or along the edge of a fence. Fertility was on everyone's mind in spring, not just in the soil, but in life itself. Couples newly married at Yule now looked forward to children. Calves, lambs, and kids were born within weeks of each other. The bleating of newborn animals filled the yards. Milk returned to the household. Cheese-making resumed, and butter churns were pulled from storage. Rituals, informal but long held, were performed to honour the season. In some places, families planted the first seed with a whispered prayer to Freya or Njord. In others, a bit of bread was buried in the corner of the field, an offering to the landwights, spirits of the soil. No elaborate temples were needed. A tree stump, a flat stone, or a particular bend in the river might hold generations of meaning. Children were taught to be quiet in these places, and to step carefully. The return of movement also meant the return of trade and news. Roads that had been buried or blocked reopened, and travellers once again passed between farms, bringing goods and gossip. A neighbour might arrive with a length of spun yarn, a carved comb, or a new spindle whirl. In exchange, he might leave with a slab of saltfish or a small wedge of cheese. No coin changed hands. Memory handled the balance sheet. For those with surplus goods, spring marked the beginning of a longer journey. Traders packed their sleds or boats and made for larger gathering points, seasonal markets or port towns. Birka, Haifabu, Kaupang, these places began to stir with distant voices and foreign wares. Even inland, local thing assemblies convened. Roads converged at hills or clearings where disputes were aired, alliances confirmed, and marriages arranged. These were not just legal gatherings. They were social events, with food, music, and shared meals. Clothing reflected the change. Woolen tunics and cloaks remained, but people washed more often, cleaned their garments, and donned accessories long kept hidden in winter. A brooch might be polished, a belt knife resharpened. Women wove new bands for their hair, or stitched coloured thread into cuffs and hems. There was no extravagance, but there was care. Spring was not a time to show wealth. It was a time to show readiness. Children, long cooped indoors, ran through puddles and climbed trees. Their energy returned with the light. Games, absent through the deep snow, were played again in open courtyards or forest edges. Stones were stacked and knocked down. Dried bones were tossed and scored. Songs, half remembered from autumn, were sung again, with new verses added. The longhouse, once the totality of life, now became only one part of it again. Work spilled outdoors. Meals were taken on benches near the door. Wood was chopped in the open air. Fires burned brighter, not for warmth, but for boiling dye or heating pitch. The change in season was not only visible, it was lived in every movement, every breath, every plan made for the months ahead. But spring was not kind to everyone. The thaw revealed what winter had hidden. A cracked beam, a rotted post, a neighbour's house empty, its hearth cold. Death, common but not always acknowledged in winter, became more visible now. Graves softened under the warming earth. Markers were repaired or replaced. Children were reminded to speak softly near burial grounds. And life moved forward, because it had to. This was the balance of the season, between birth and memory, between hunger and preparation, between the quiet endurance of winter and the loud demands of the growing world. In this brief window, people did not rest. They rebuilt. And the land, reluctant but ready, allowed it. As the thaw gave way to true warmth and the first green shoots stretched above the soil, activity along the coasts intensified. The sea, once locked by ice and storm, began to move again under calmer skies. Harbours and inlets that had lain silent for months echoed once more with the creak of timber and the slap of water against hulls. Spring was not only the beginning of farming, it was the beginning of sailing. Maritime life in Viking Age Scandinavia was never separate from the rest of society. Even inland communities understood that the sea brought goods, stories, danger, and change. Boats were common, used not only for raiding or exploration, but for fishing, ferrying livestock, visiting neighbouring farms, and attending regional things. Some were simple rowboats for calm lakes. Others were broader cargo ships, designed to carry wool, smoked fish, and timber to distant markets. And then there were the sleek, narrow longships, fast, shallow-drafted vessels that could cut through fjords and river mouths with equal ease. Not everyone built ships, but everyone knew someone who did. Shipbuilding was a craft, passed through families and refined by time. The tools were basic: axes, adzes, saws, drills. The skill was in the eye and the hand, knowing how to choose timber with the right curvature, how to split and season planks, how to join hulls with overlapping boards and seal them tight with animal hair and tar. Oak was the favoured wood for strength, pine for flexibility, ash for oars. Iron nails were precious. Tree nails, pegs of hard wood, were often used in their place. A ship was never just a vessel. It was a symbol. For the wealthy, it was a sign of prestige and reach. For others, it was the bridge between survival and hardship. When a longship was ready to launch, it marked more than a departure. It was a shift in a household's fortune. Sons might leave to seek silver. Fathers might sail to markets across the Baltic. A few might go further still, answering calls from foreign courts or joining fleets headed west. Coastal settlements buzzed with preparation. Sails, woven in winter from thick wool, were stretched and repaired. Ropes were braided from horsehair or hemp. Food was packed. Flatbread, dried meat, barrels of water or weak ale. Weapons were sharpened, though not every voyage was martial. Trade, after all, paid more often and lasted longer than plunder. Still, raiding remained a reality. It was not the norm, not the daily business of most Norsemen, but it was present, seasonal, and opportunistic. Young men, especially those without land to inherit, saw in raiding the chance to gain silver, goods, or reputation. A successful voyage might return with coin, weapons, glass beads, or even slaves, foreign captives who would be sold or absorbed into the household economy. These raids were rarely as dramatic as later stories suggested. They were fast, targeted, and often aimed at undefended coastal communities, monasteries, or trading posts. A fleet might strike and be gone before any local defence could be organised, but such voyages carried risk. Storms, poor maps, hostile locals, and disease all claimed their share. Many who left in spring were not seen again. For most households, however, the maritime season meant trade, not conflict. Traders followed known routes to the Slavic ports along the southern Baltic, to Frisia and Saxony, or deeper into the rivers of what is now Russia and Ukraine. These journeys brought back salt, iron tools, pottery, silk, wine, and coins. Some of these coins were spent, but more often they were hoarded, weighed, and used to show status. Navigation relied on experience, memory, and environmental cues. There were no compasses. Sailors read the sea's colour and texture, the flight of birds, the smell of land carried on the wind. The sun, moon, and stars guided them when visible. In cloudy weather, landmarks, cliffs, islands, river mouths marked progress. Stories and rhymes preserved routes. How many days between one cape and another, which winds to expect, where fresh water could be found. Those who stayed behind watched the sea differently. The return of a sail was an event. Families waited on the rocks, eyes straining toward the horizon. A sail meant news, perhaps wealth, perhaps loss. The returning crew would be thinner, dirtier, often louder. They carried foreign goods, foreign habits, sometimes foreign wounds. They brought stories of cities where markets never closed, of temples filled with gold, of armies 10,000 strong, of gods no one could name. And then they returned to the ordinary, hauling nets, mending fences, eating barley soup by firelight. The sea might take them again next year, or not. Few men sailed forever. Most returned to land, built homes, married, and handed down their stories with a quiet pride that never quite matched the noise of the tales. Back in the villages, these stories took on new life. Children repeated them with additions. Skalds worked them into verse. Some became cautionary, others heroic. A necklace might be said to come from Miklagard, whether it did or not. A knife might be rumoured to have belonged to a Saxon king. These exaggerations were not lies. They were a form of meaning-making, a way of connecting the local to the legendary. But the majority of people never sailed more than a few fjords away from home. Their lives were spent with their hands in the soil, their thoughts on harvests, and their hopes pinned to the health of their animals. They knew the names of traders and raiders, but saw them only in passing. The world beyond the hills or beyond the sea was as distant to them as the gods. Yet even they were touched by the ocean. The iron tool they used came from a trader's pack. The beads on their daughter's necklace had crossed half a continent. The comb in the elder's beard might bear a pattern first carved in the east. The sea was not separate. It was simply the outer ring of their world, blurred but real. By early summer, the rhythm of land and sea had settled into its pattern. Fields were growing, nets were full, markets were open. The longhouse door stood wide. Children watched the horizon not with fear, but with wonder. And for those who left, whether to trade, to raid, or simply to see what lay beyond the headland, the world waited just as it always had, unmapped, uncertain, and full of stories waiting to be returned. By late summer, the first edge of cold returned. Not harsh, but enough to sharpen the wind that moved through the trees and passed beneath door frames. The sun still lingered, but its warmth was thinner. Shadows grew longer across the fields. Birds gathered in flocks, preparing to leave. The people did not speak of winter yet. They never had to. Its return was assumed, like the tide. The barley had begun to golden. The heads bowed under their own weight, signalling that harvest was near. This was a time of both satisfaction and anxiety. If the crops were full, the community breathed easier, but not freely. A single storm, a cold snap, or a mould creeping through damp grain could undo months of labour. And so, vigilance remained constant. Children were taught to walk lightly through the fields, to chase off birds, and to fetch adults at the first sign of rot or broken stalks. Hay had already been cut and stacked in high thatch piles. The smell of drying grass hung in the air. These stores were guarded closely. If they spoiled, the animals would suffer. In wealthier farmsteads, wooden barns elevated the hay off the ground to preserve it from damp. Elsewhere, stones or woven mats were used to keep it dry. Even a small difference in storage meant life or death for a flock during the months to come. The rhythm of the day changed again. The long, stretched-out labour of early summer gave way to a more pressing tempo. There was no longer time for slow repairs or leisurely travel. The last of the goods from spring and summer trade were brought home and secured. Oars and sails were stored. Iron tools were greased. Leather was scrubbed and salted. Everything that could be made ready for winter was touched, checked, and placed with care. Livestock were counted and assessed. Animals that would not make it through the cold, too old, too weak, too many mouths to feed, were marked for slaughter. It was not an act of cruelty. It was a calculation. The meat would be preserved, the skins tanned, the bones boiled, the sinew dried for cord. In this season, nothing was wasted. The best of the herd was kept back for breeding, and pregnant animals were watched with the same hope and caution given to fields of grain. Preservation resumed in full. Smokehouses worked day and night. Fish and meat hung from rafters. Roots were buried deep in dry pits. Berries, picked in huge quantities during midsummer, were now cooked down into thick pastes or sealed in jars with honey. Even the smallest offerings from the land, hazelnuts, wild onions, crab apples, were gathered and stored. A careful household had little waste, not out of virtue, but necessity. Inside the longhouse, work returned to preparation. Wool was spun in thicker strands. Rough cloaks were patched at the elbows and hems. Mittens were relined. Children's garments were lengthened or handed down. Fires were lit earlier in the day. Doors remained closed longer in the mornings. Every hour of labour now had an undertone of urgency. Do it now, while the light lasts, while the earth is soft, while the stores are full. The sea too began to quiet. Traders made their last voyages. Ships returned home. Beaches that had been full of sound, oars slapping water, sails snapping in the wind, fell silent. Some ships were pulled up and overturned for repair. Others were tarred and wrapped for winter. Men who had travelled far now walked the village paths again, their accents softened, their eyes a little more distant. Most brought stories. A few brought coin. All brought with them the reminder that while adventure could stretch across the sea, life would always pull them back to land. In many villages, this was the time for weddings, not as spontaneous celebrations, but as economic and familial agreements. A successful harvest meant enough resources to start a household. A surplus of food, wool, or livestock was offered as dowry. These unions were public, practical, and celebrated without excess. A feast might include smoked lamb, flatbread, curd cheese, and ale sweetened with late-season honey. The gifts were modest, the expectations were clear. Children watched these rituals closely, not only for amusement, but because they marked the cycle of life that governed everything. A girl who helped make the bride's wreath one year might wear one herself the next. A boy who fetched water at his cousin's wedding might soon be old enough to help slaughter the pig or stack the firewood. These were the transitions that shaped identity more than age. And still, the harvest loomed. In the final weeks of summer, the entire community bent toward the fields. Sickles were sharpened again, baskets repaired, rope woven anew. People moved through the grain like shadows, cutting, binding, stacking, lifting. Work began before sunrise and ended only when the stars appeared. Fingers bled, backs ached, but no one stopped. Every bundle mattered. Every stalk carried weight. Grain was laid out to dry on flat stones or woven mats. The wind helped, so did the sun, now cooler but still strong enough to bake the damp from the sheaves. Once dry, the threshing began. Slow, careful, rhythmic. Children danced to its beat. Elders tapped their feet. The sound of the flail echoed between buildings, through yards, and across fields. When the grain was finally stored, and the last of the berries sealed in clay, and the smokehouse cooled for the last time, there was a moment, a breath, where the village stilled. Not in laziness, not in celebration, but in shared understanding. The year had turned. The work of survival was not done, but the work of preparation was. And just before the chill returned to stay, people allowed themselves one final night of laughter. A communal fire, a shared song, a story told too many times but loved all the same. These were the echoes of resilience, the quiet rituals that reminded everyone they had made it once more through the cycle, that they had held on to one another, that they had prepared enough to endure whatever waited beyond the frost. The first frost returned, not with fanfare, but with quiet certainty. One morning, the grass crackled underfoot. The breath of livestock turned visible again. Buckets left outside held a thin layer of ice. No one was surprised. The season had simply arrived, as it always did, without asking permission. By now, the stores were full, or nearly so. The grain was sealed, the meat dried, the tools were hung on pegs or stored in bundles, waiting for their winter tasks. Firewood had been stacked and restacked in tidy rows beneath the eaves. Children knew not to touch the top layers. The men knew by heart how much would last through the coldest month if burned sparingly. This final shift marked the beginning of winter, not just as a season, but as a state of mind. The outward work slowed. The inward work began. The longhouse became the world again. Hearth fires burned longer. Food was prepared more slowly. Conversations drifted into storytelling more often. The pace of life narrowed into a kind of patient compression. In this cycle, there were no shortcuts. No great inventions would lift the weight of survival. No distant ruler would intervene to improve daily life. Every comfort came from labour already done. Every quiet night near the fire was purchased in advance by hours in the field, on the hillside, or by the shore. It was a balance that everyone understood intuitively, even the youngest among them. But there was beauty in this life, not in its comforts, which were few, but in its structure. Every gesture had meaning. A sheaf of barley wasn't just food, it was memory, trust, and future promise. A well-patched tunic was not just warmth, it was a record of care, made stitch by stitch by someone whose hands carried generations of knowledge. A meal shared was never just about hunger. It was about solidarity, about kin, about keeping the world whole through bitter wind and darkness. The longhouse, though simple, was more than shelter. It was a container of stories, of rituals, of unspoken rules passed down without writing. The hearth was not just fire, it was continuity, the same light that had warmed faces now long buried, and that would, if fortune held, warm faces yet to be born. Each season turned the house into something new, and the people with it. Life here was not idyllic, it was hard. The body bent early, teeth wore down. Illness struck without reason or remedy. Grief was common, but grief was not hidden away. It was woven into the rhythm of things. A carved mark on a beam. A necklace passed from mother to daughter. A story told again each winter about someone who once swung an axe better than anyone else. Time in this world was not measured in minutes or appointments. It was measured in cycles. The time to sow, the time to shear, the time to mend, the time to let the field lie fallow. Even death, when it came, was seen as part of the order. Not welcome, but expected, like the snows or the sudden wind that bent the pine trees. And so, if you time-travelled to ancient Scandinavia, not to its legends, but to its truth, you would not find warriors on every ridge or gold in every hall. You would find people tending sheep, repairing buckets, sharpening sickles, spinning wool with quiet hands. You would find children helping without complaint, not because they were especially obedient, but because they knew that help was needed. You would find old men who remembered colder winters, and old women who could tell you which root to chew when your stomach turned sour. You would find silence, but not emptiness, stillness, but not idleness. You would also find laughter, dry, sparse, but real. You would find pride, not shouted but earned, and you would find the deep weight of belonging, not as identity, but as necessity. Everyone had a place, and every place was formed by those who stayed. To live here, to truly live here, would mean unlearning the idea that comfort is the same as happiness. It would mean understanding that satisfaction can come from a job well done, even when no one sees it. That memory can be stored not only in books, but in hands. That love can be shown in a well-mended sock, or in a bowl of soup left beside a sleeping elder. There is much about this world that would be unfamiliar. The closeness, the cold, the absence of choice. But there is much, too, that would feel instinctively right. The sense of rhythm, the clarity of purpose, the knowledge that survival was a shared effort, that no one truly lived alone, that even the dead remained, in some small way, in the shape of the land, in the tools they made, in the stories still told when the fire grew low. And perhaps that is the quiet truth of the Viking Age, not just an age of sails and swords, but an age of seasons, of soil, of endurance. A world where every gesture mattered, where the turning of the wheel was felt not in history books, but in hands calloused by grain and wind and time. And when the snow came again, when the windows frosted and the livestock huddled closer to the house, and the fire snapped and whispered against the dark, life would not stop. It would continue, as it always had, slowly, quietly, deliberately, not out of stubbornness, but out of trust, that the seasons would return, and that the work would be worth it, that the land would remember, just as its people did.